What if I told you some of Queen Elizabeth's thoughts who've been locked away for decades were actually written down? The most powerful woman in the world left behind a private record, and what it reveals about her own son is more shocking than anyone expected. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on what Queen Elizabeth's private journal really reveals and what it has to do with Charles. Most people assume a mother always believes in her son, but Queen Elizabeth was not most mothers. She was the monarch first and a parent second, and from remarkably early on, sources close to the palace suggest that Elizabeth harbored a quiet, persistent unease about Charles that never fully went away. It started not with scandal, but with character. Those who served inside Buckingham Palace during the 1970s and 1980s consistently described Charles as emotionally demanding, difficult to please, and increasingly disconnected from the stoic, duty-first values his mother embodied. Elizabeth valued silence over complaint. Charles preferred letters, long, winding, philosophical letters sent to politicians, architects, and public figures, expressing opinions a future king arguably had no business expressing publicly. Elizabeth reportedly found this deeply uncomfortable. She had spent her entire reign carefully avoiding anything that could be interpreted as political interference, but Charles seemed almost compelled toward it. Insiders recall that Elizabeth would receive reports of Charles's latest public pronouncements and respond with what one former aide described as a very long pause. That pause said everything. Charles grew up in a household where emotional warmth was not the currency of daily life. Elizabeth and Philip were products of a generation and an institution that did not perform affection, but Charles craved it. He has spoken openly in interviews about feeling isolated as a child, about longing for a closeness his parents simply couldn't give. What is less known is that Elizabeth reportedly viewed this emotional neediness with something close to concern, not cruelty, concern. A king who needed constant reassurance was, in her mind, a vulnerability the monarchy could not afford. She had watched her own father, King George VI, carry the weight of the crown with quiet sacrifice and zero complaint. She expected the same from her son, but Charles was wired differently, and nowhere was that more visible than in his writing. Charles was known for what became infamous inside royal circles as his Black Spider memos, handwritten letters fired off to governments, ministers on everything from hospital food to the future of rural farming. What is less widely known is that Elizabeth was briefed on many of these letters, and according to sources familiar with the palace's internal communications, her reaction was rarely positive. She never publicly contradicted him. That was not her way. But privately, there were conversations, careful, measured conversations, about whether Charles's interventionist instincts were compatible with the constitutional role he was destined to fill. Think about that. The Queen of England was quietly questioning whether her own heir truly understood what being king required. Not once, not twice, but consistently, across decades. These were not the doubts of a difficult moment. They were the doubts of a woman who watched, waited, and worried in private for years, and the journal, sources suggest, is where those worries finally found a voice. But if Elizabeth's doubts about Charles's judgment ran deep, it was Camilla Parker Bowles who turned those doubts into something far more permanent. This was not simply a mother disapproving of a son's romantic choices. This was a queen watching her heir make a decision that she believed could destabilize the entire institution she had given her life to protect, and Elizabeth never forgot it. To understand Elizabeth's reaction to Camilla, you have to understand the world Elizabeth came from. Duty was not a word, it was a way of life. She had watched her uncle Edward VIII abandon the throne for a woman the establishment deemed unsuitable. That decision had scarred the monarchy and scarred her father in ways that never fully healed. So when Charles began his affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, a married woman, while he himself was married to Diana, Elizabeth did not just see a personal failing. She saw history threatening to repeat itself. Sources familiar with Elizabeth's private circle suggest she was not merely disappointed. She was, in the words of one former courtier, quietly furious, but fury for Elizabeth never looked like fury for anyone else. It looked like distance. It looked like formal politeness, where warmth used to be. It looked like Camilla's name being absent from guest lists for years. What most people don't realize is just how long Elizabeth kept Camilla at arm's length. For nearly 2 decades after Charles and Diana's marriage collapsed, Camilla was effectively persona non grata at official royal events. Elizabeth did not invite her to family gatherings. She did not include her in private dinners at Sandringham or Balmoral. When Charles formally requested that Elizabeth receive Camilla, a request that carries enormous weight in royal protocol, Elizabeth delayed. She waited years before finally agreeing to a formal introduction, and even then, sources suggest, the warmth was carefully managed and deliberately limited. She eventually accepted Camilla, but acceptance and trust are very different things. Elizabeth was too shrewd a political operator not to understand that blocking Camilla entirely would create its own crisis. But privately, the wound remained open, and according to sources, the journal entries from the period surrounding Charles and Diana's divorce contain Elizabeth's most unguarded reflections on her son's character. Not rage, not melodrama, something quieter and more devastating. A mother recording, in careful measured language, her genuine uncertainty about whether Charles possessed the moral steadiness a king required. She had watched him pursue Camilla through his marriage. She had watched him allow the affair to become public knowledge. She had watched the institution she had protected for 50 years take a battering in the tabloids because of choices her son made, and she wrote it down, not to destroy him, but because Elizabeth processed the world through duty, and writing, for her, was a form of accountability. The journal was never meant to be seen, but the fact that it exists, and that its contents are now surfacing, tells you everything about how significant those doubts truly were. Camilla may now wear a crown, but the woman who had to approve that crown never fully made peace with how the story began. But Camilla is only one part of this story, because to truly understand what Elizabeth wrote in that journal, and why, you have to understand her relationship with Diana, and it is far more complicated and far warmer than the palace has ever wanted the public to know. When Diana Spencer entered the royal family in 1981, Elizabeth initially saw exactly what the monarchy needed. Young, beautiful, magnetic, a woman who could modernize the image of the crown without threatening its foundations. Elizabeth was not blind to Diana's qualities. In private, she reportedly admired Diana's instinctive connection with ordinary people, something Elizabeth herself had always managed through discipline rather than natural ease. Diana had it naturally, but then the marriage began to fracture, and Elizabeth found herself in an impossible position. What is rarely discussed is the extent to which Elizabeth received detailed briefings on the state of Charles and Diana's marriage from both sides. She was not an uninformed bystander. She knew about Charles's continued relationship with Camilla. She knew about Diana's profound unhappiness, and sources suggest she knew far earlier than has ever been publicly acknowledged. The question was never whether Elizabeth knew. The question was what she chose to do with what she knew. Insiders suggest that Elizabeth made several private approaches to Charles, not confrontational, never that, but quiet, pointed conversations in which she made clear that the situation was becoming untenable. Charles reportedly did not respond the way she hoped, and then Diana died, and everything shifted. After Diana's death in 1997, Elizabeth made a series of decisions that, viewed individually, seemed like protocol, but viewed together, tell a very different story. She ensured Diana's funeral was a state occasion in all but name, against the initial instincts of several senior palace advisors who wanted a smaller, more private ceremony. She personally ensured that the description of Diana as the people's princess became woven into the public language of mourning. She ensured Diana's sons walked behind their mother's coffin, a decision that sources say she made with full knowledge of the psychological weight it would place on 2 young boys. but believed was necessary. These were not the decisions of a woman who had written Diana off. They were the decisions of a woman who understood Diana's value to the public, to the institution, and perhaps most privately, as a symbol of everything she felt Charles had failed to protect. What the journal reportedly captures, and what sources describe as its most quietly devastating passages, is Elizabeth reflecting on Diana not as a problem the palace had to manage, but as a woman her son had failed. That framing is everything, because it means Elizabeth's grief after Diana's death was not purely public performance. It was personal. It was a mother acknowledging in private that her son's choices had led directly to a tragedy, that the institution she had spent her life building had been damaged because of decisions he made. She never said it publicly. She never would, but she wrote it down. And that, according to sources, is perhaps the most haunting section of the entire journal. But here is the question nobody inside the palace wanted to ask out loud. What if skipping Charles was never entirely off the table? It sounds unthinkable, but sources familiar with the inner workings of the palace suggest that during the darkest years of the 1990s, quiet conversations were happening at senior levels about the future of the succession, and those conversations went further than anyone has ever officially admitted. The 1990s were, without question, the most turbulent decade the modern monarchy had faced. The marriages of 3 of Elizabeth's 4 children collapsed. Windsor Castle caught fire. The public's relationship with the crown shifted from reverence to scrutiny, and at the centre of it all was Charles. His marriage to Diana had imploded publicly and catastrophically. His affair with Camilla was no longer a secret. His approval ratings at a time when such things were beginning to matter were at historic lows. Inside the palace, senior advisors were not simply managing a public relations crisis, they were quietly gaming out scenarios. What would it mean for the monarchy if Charles's path to the throne continued to generate this level of instability? Was there an alternative? And that is where William enters the picture. William was, from a very young age, being prepared at a pace and intensity that went beyond standard royal grooming. His education at Eton was more deliberately structured around future leadership than Charles's had been at the equivalent stage. His public appearances from his mid-teens onward were carefully calibrated to build an independent public profile, and crucially, Elizabeth took an unusually direct personal interest in William's development. More direct, sources suggest, than she had ever taken in Charles's at the same age. Senior figures close to Elizabeth have privately acknowledged that she saw in William something she had struggled to see in Charles, a natural, instinctive understanding of what the crown required in terms of restraint, duty, and public image. William didn't need to be taught to be stoic. It appeared to come naturally. Now, skipping Charles entirely would have required a constitutional mechanism that in practical terms was almost certainly never going to be triggered. The line of succession is not simply a family preference, it is enshrined in law. But what Elizabeth could do, and what sources suggest she did do, was shape the conditions around Charles's eventual reign in ways that limited his room for maneuver. The decision to keep Camilla's title as princess consort rather than queen consort was Elizabeth's. The decision to ensure William and Catherine were positioned as the public face of the modern monarchy long before Charles ascended was Elizabeth's. The decision to keep certain ceremonial powers structured in ways that empowered the next generation was Elizabeth's. These were not random choices. They were, sources suggest, a woman quietly building a framework that reflected her true feelings about where the monarchy's future actually lay, not with her son, but with her grandson. And if the journal confirms what sources are now suggesting, that Elizabeth documented these preferences explicitly, then what we are looking at is not just a mother's doubt, it is a queen's quiet verdict, written down in her own hand. And yet, despite everything, Charles is king. He has finally achieved the role he was born for, waited decades for, and was never quite trusted with in his mother's eyes. But the ground beneath that crown has never been entirely stable, and the journal revelation explains why in ways no official biography ever could, because there is a difference between inheriting a throne and being trusted with one. When Elizabeth died in September 2022, the outpouring of public grief was extraordinary. But quietly, beneath the pageantry and the mourning, something else was happening inside the palace. A transition of power that, according to insiders, was not as smooth as the carefully managed public imagery suggested. Charles moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, some felt. Within weeks of his mother's death, significant changes were being made to palace staff, to the structure of the royal household, and to ceremonial traditions Elizabeth had maintained for 70 years. Some of these changes were practical, but others felt, to those inside the institution, like a man who had waited too long and was now asserting himself too fast. One former senior aide, speaking anonymously, described the atmosphere in the weeks after Elizabeth's death as unsettled in a way that surprised people who thought they knew what to expect. And then there were the departures. A significant number of the senior courtiers and household staff who served Elizabeth most closely chose not to continue in their roles under Charles. Some retired, some quietly moved on, but the pattern was noticeable enough that it was remarked upon privately among those who tracked the inner workings of the palace. These were not people leaving because of age or convenience. These were people who had devoted decades to serving the crown under Elizabeth, and who found the atmosphere under Charles fundamentally different in ways they were not comfortable with. That detail matters. Courtiers at that level do not walk away from the monarchy lightly. Then there is the matter of Camilla's coronation. Charles's decision to confirm before the ceremony that Camilla would be crowned queen alongside him was not simply a romantic gesture. It was a political signal, and for many inside the institution, it landed badly. Elizabeth had been deliberate about keeping Camilla's formal status ambiguous during her lifetime. That ambiguity was a message. Charles removed it within months of her death. Sources familiar with the views of senior palace figures suggest this was seen, in certain quarters, as Charles prioritizing his personal wishes over the institutional instincts his mother had spent decades carefully calibrating. It was, in the eyes of some, the latest in a long line of decisions that confirmed Elizabeth's private doubts had been well-founded. The monarchy survives. It always survives. But it survives right now with a king whose own mother left behind a private record suggesting she was never entirely certain he was ready. That is not a small thing. That is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. Which brings me to the question that nobody inside the palace can afford to answer publicly. If Elizabeth didn't fully trust Charles, what does that mean for the monarchy now? This is not just history. This is the live question at the heart of the British crown in 2024. William knows. He is aware of his grandmother's feelings, the special bond they shared, the private conversations, the weight of what Elizabeth believed about the future of the institution. He has spoken carefully in various interviews about how much Elizabeth meant to him. But what is less discussed is how William now navigates his relationship with his father, knowing, as sources suggest he does, the full depth of what Elizabeth privately recorded. William is not a confrontational man by nature, but he is a strategic one. His decision to position himself and Catherine as a separate, modernizing force within the monarchy, with their own communications team, their own public agenda, their own carefully managed distance from the drama surrounding Charles and Camilla, is not accidental. It is entirely deliberate. William is building something, and he is building it with the quiet awareness that the institution he will one day lead has deep, unresolved fractures running through it. Then there is Harry. Whatever you think of the choices Harry has made since leaving royal life, and opinions are fierce on both sides, his central claim has always been the same, that the institution failed his family, that it prioritized its own survival over the people inside it. The journal revelation does not vindicate Harry entirely, but it does something almost more uncomfortable. It suggests that even Elizabeth, the ultimate institutional loyalist, privately shared doubts about the very character at the center of Harry's grievances. That is a complicated thing to sit with. The British monarchy has survived revolutions, abdications, world wars, and decades of tabloid scrutiny, but it has always survived by projecting an image of unshakable continuity. The journal chips away at that image in a very specific and very damaging way, because it suggests that the continuity was, at least in part, a performance, that behind closed doors the woman who embodied the crown more completely than anyone in the modern era had private reservations she never felt she could voice. And she was right not to, at the time. But now those reservations are surfacing, and the question the palace cannot easily answer is this: if Elizabeth didn't fully trust Charles, why should the public? That question is now in the room, and it is not going away. Queen Elizabeth reigned for 70 years. She said almost nothing she didn't intend to say, but if the journal is what sources suggest, a private record of doubts she never felt she could express publicly, then the most powerful silence of her reign wasn't a silence at all. It was written down, in her own hand, and now it's coming to light. So we want to ask you directly, do you think Elizabeth was right to keep her doubts about Charles private for the sake of the institution, or did her silence ultimately do more damage than the truth would have? Does the journal change how you see Charles as king? And perhaps most importantly, does it change how you see the monarchy itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. In our next video, we will be examining the private correspondence between Charles and palace advisors that suggests the transition of power after Elizabeth's death was far more contested than anyone has officially admitted. If you want to be there for that, subscribe now and make sure the bell is on, because this one will not be one to miss.